What can one person do? I think that's the question I'm going to address in this episode of the What's Wrong with America podcast. It is Thursday, March 31st, 2022. I'm your host, Daniel D. It's been a minute. I took some time off, partially because I was grappling with this question here. I think now it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that there is something really wrong with America right now, and indeed much of the modern world. And the problem seemed to be, endemic. I mean, some of our biggest institutions, our most fundamental institutions in the United States, have been captured by some yahoos. I mean, the inmates are running the asylum. All you got to do is listen to some of these leaked recordings of, whether it's the Disney Corporation, their executives, or whether it's, the New York Times, or any number of these institutions that recordings come to light of behind the scenes when they don't think anybody can hear them, what they really think, what they really want to do, what their vision really is for the country. And it's like, you multiply that by all these major institutions in media, government, publicly traded corporations, even now hedge funds and mutual funds and whatnot, the big banks, big tech, big entertainment industry, just down the line. And one of the worst ones is in the educational arena, both higher education and, elementary, secondary education. It's just crazy. So the question comes up is like, well, what can one person do? What can I do? It's one of the things that I came back to, is Stephen Covey in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of the habits is basically focusing on what you can control. I think he called it your sphere of influence versus your sphere of concern. And the way Covey put it is that if you spend a lot of time focused on your sphere of concern, and your sphere of concern is much greater than your sphere of influence, you're really not going to be very effective. Focus on those things that you can actually change or do something about, and as you do that, your sphere of influence will increase in size and hopefully overtake more of those things that you might be concerned about, which is very good advice. It's difficult in this time when you see the country that you love. There's a lot to love about the United States. There's a lot of flaws. Sure, it's not perfect, but it's a country that has had the guts to acknowledge its flaws more than any other. I think you're not going to see China or Russia, or India publicly discuss its own shortcomings the way that the United States of America, the people, discuss the shortcomings of the United States. And as long as it's done in an attitude of how do we make it better, then that's great. Let's continue to improve, let's focus. But it needs to be a balanced conversation, of course. Don't just focus on where America misses the mark, but let's keep in perspective. We live in this world where nobody's perfect, and there's a lot of worse options out there than being an American. As the comedian Richard Jeni, and a great stand-up, by the way, his special, A Big Steaming Pile of Me, highly recommend it. But anyway, one of the things that he was talking about in there is like, that America needed a slogan, and one of the things he came up with was like 20 million illegal immigrants can't be wrong, or something like that. 20 million illegal aliens can't be wrong. Well, there's some truth to that, right? Because as he points out in his bit, it's like, anytime you hear about somebody risking their life, trying to sail across the ocean in a homemade raft to, it's never somebody leaving here to go there. It's always the other way around, right? So it's like, we need to keep that in perspective when we're talking about the shortcomings of America. There's been a lot of good And I guess it goes for me too, in talking about the What's Wrong with America podcast, and you say what's right with America. And I think one of the things that I come back to, what can one person do? A lot of it has to do with the local stuff. I think in America, in its best, in America's best moments as a country, as a culture, has been those times where really it's not been this unified national culture or a unified national sort of propaganda machine getting everybody to do something. It's been really the fact that apparatus has gotten out of the way of people at a local level living out, lives in accordance with values that are meaningful to them. And obviously it's a balancing act because, for example, one of the stains on America has been, racism and slavery and Jim Crow and all that. Which, of course, the United States has done a tremendous job in overcoming. It's not to say that it's completely there. Maybe it's one of those things that you never completely arrive. But, good Lord, look at the way the United States is today in 2022 compared to how it was in 1962. Right? Just 60 years ago. Night and day difference in terms of the experience or the reality of being a black person in the United States. And it's one of those things where I think it's important to acknowledge, yes, our history, warts and all, but also the good stuff, because people had this myopic view. I encountered somebody on social media, which I've tried to get away from, and now I just, do the post and ghost strategy on my better days, because it's just not worth getting into debates with people on social media. There was somebody who, and they seriously made the statement that, how do I know as a white person that it's not worse for, that racism isn't a worse problem for black people today than it was in 1963? Because I made that point. And there's always an idiot who will take, and not ironically, and not just playing devil's advocate, but really seriously, this is what they think. That was their whole thing. I looked on their profile and it's a bunch of pronouns and BLM stuff and whatever. But that's what they said. They said, how do you as a white person know that it's not worse? Racism for black people is not worse today than it was in 1963. And I'm like, I replied once with a kind of, well, let's compare the difference in treatment between BLM protesters / rioters and civil rights marchers in 1963. A pretty big difference there. 1963, you had children who were not rioting in Birmingham in 1963. There was no destruction of property or no attacks on innocent people. No, they were just protesting silently, peacefully, holding signs saying, quoting Bible verses, things like that. And what was the response? The response was like the police throwing them in jail, sicking police dogs on them, turning on the fire hoses and blasting them. And that's some real stuff too, because you can see, that's some powerful water, because it will knock these kids down and they'll skid across the street, almost like if you've ever skipped a rock across like a pond or a stream, the way the rock will skip across the surface of the water. It's kind of like the way they would skid across the surface of the pavement, right? So I'm like, you look at that. Look at the footage from 1963 and then look at the footage from 2020 and compare. 2020, it's like you have police out there, and elected officials bending the knee, kneeling down in front of these people who've been rioting. Some have been peacefully protesting, but some have been rioting, like actually just targeting passersby, behaving like bullies, basically. Like, you better raise your fist and say Black Lives Matter, or, whatever, right? I mean, so what I'm saying is like, you can't, with a serious person, a serious, honest human being, can't look at the United States in 2022 and say, oh, racism, white racism towards black people is worse or just as bad in 2022 as it was in 1963. It's not even close. It's improved by a million times. So, anyway, I get back to the point of saying you got to acknowledge where things have improved, where a good job has been done, but not just with race relations. But I mean, I'm thinking specifically about, America's weathered some real crises in the past. So I'll point to the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, World War II, that era. America got through that, and it could have gone differently, but I think what kept America together at that time was really community, family, like that kind of thing on a local level. America at that point was still more agrarian, more rural than urban. So more people lived in small towns or communities than lived in big cities. People tended to know their neighbors. People tended to know each other and look out for each other too. You read accounts or hear accounts of people who were alive during the Depression, right? I mean, it was a rough time. You had, in some cases, I mean, actual whole families like destitute, going around begging. I mean, with the Dust Bowl in particular, had a lot of migrant families that their farms were ruined and so forth. What got America through that? And I think again, not to say that everything was great back then, but one of the things that I noticed is a lot of people that grew up in that era, when they were older, many of them look back at that time as being almost this golden age. Not to say that they would want to go through it again, but kind of like the camaraderie among people, the connection that people had, these deep connections with each other. Getting through a shared crisis like that. Same thing with World War II. And I could understand that, having been in the Army, I wouldn't want to, if it was an option for me now, I wouldn't want to go re-enlist, especially not at my current age, I'd be a little out of shape. I don't know how well I would do on the PT test. But one of the things about that is like when you have anything that you're involved with that's like a shared experience among people who are, kind of together going through it, it really builds a bond. There's a lot of camaraderie. And I think that's something that, if you look at what's wrong with America today, that's one of the things that's really been missing, is more and more over the last few generations, we've gone from a country where most people live in towns where everybody pretty much knows everybody. There's not a lot of call for somebody to be to be just all charm and no substance, because people find you out. If you're just one of these hucksters who's talks a good game, who's, this oily faced, salesman type, but you're dishonest, you're greedy, you don't give a shit about other people, you can't get very far with that in a society where everybody knows everybody and people are pretty much like you're in a town where personal relationships really matter a lot, where people really try to look out for each other. And I think there's something basic about a basic sort of Christian society of people who really try to live out their faith in a meaningful way to improve the lives of the people around them. To be a good person to those nearest and dearest to them. Of course, it's others too, but there's just something about that when a town has people who are connected in that way, who are living with the fear of God in a healthy sense, love of God, and you have a community, and that is a resilient, stable society. The federal government, I guess you could point to the Great Depression and some of FDR's responses. Or maybe you could go back further to Wilson, the progressive era. I don't know. But at some point, a change occurred where today, if something goes wrong, because you don't have those deep, meaningful relationships with your neighbors like you used to, because society is more transient, people move around more, there's not these stable relationships across time, there's not loyalty, that people would have had to each other at that time. People, you may, and it's a weird paradox of living in a city or even a suburb. It's like you live in closer and closer proximity to other people, and yet the relationships are less and less meaningful, more and more just shallow, superficial, one-off, and people will even try to bring in these kind of marketplace, we'll try to bring in these sort of family/friendship norms into the marketplace, into your job, into whatever, but it's always one-sided. It feels very manipulative, right? Where there's this and I'll just use an example from working in restaurants, right? If you've ever worked in a restaurant, maybe you saw this where they would try to, oh, these are our guests. These aren't customers. These are our guests. We need to make them feel at home in this, or whatnot, right? And I get why people will say that, but it's totally one-sided. It's like there's no reciprocation. It's like it's not a real relationship, in other words. It's like they'll try to get you to look at something that's just purely an economic business transaction as, friendship or whatever. And it's not, But people are so maybe hungry for that today that maybe it works sometimes. I don't know, But the thing is like you talk to people who grew up during the Depression. There's fewer of them alive today, But if you've ever talked to people like that, there's something about the society at the time, even in the cities, where people really did care about each other more, in a way that people don't today. And I think that's obviously a big problem. But when you're looking at what can one person do when all our institutions are captured, and there's this increasing centralization of power and control and, and whatnot. The internet, which was supposed to democratize things and make it easier for ordinary people to, to function on a level playing field with bigger institutions. Well, then it turned out to have the opposite effect over the last few years. It's gone the other way towards this increasing centralization, where now you have a few digital town halls or public spaces, essentially, but they're privately controlled, and the power rests in the hands of just a handful of billionaires, who can decide on a whim, no, we don't like this point of view. It should never be expressed in the public square, And it seemed like, oh, well, of course, hate speech, right? Who wants somebody on there talking about how this racial group needs to be wiped out, preaching genocide or whatever? Yeah, well, it sounds good, but that's what it winds up happening. Well, it turns out to be something where it's like just ordinary people concerned about what the schools are teaching their children. It's like, oh, you're a domestic terrorist and you're going to get shut down now. Or you're truckers and you're protesting, the government lockdown or the government mandates, well, therefore, even though it's a totally peaceful protest, we're going to slander you as Nazis and we're going to try to silence, or freeze your bank accounts, all that. Anyway, with the big institutions being totally captured, and this is a global thing too. It's not just the United States. I mean, you saw that with the Canadian trucker convoy. I mean, you have this World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, basically Dr. Strangelove, 2.0. It's a global thing. As an individual, there's really not a lot you can do globally or nationally, but locally you can. And I think that's the important takeaway is in your own life. Obviously, it's cliche. Try to be a better person. to those around you. Try to be more, effective as a person. Focus on your sphere of influence. But I think this is something like, if there's real food shortages coming, which Biden admitted that there are, try to prepare. Try to get some supplies. Try to connect with people that live near you. Or be in a place where you are in a community of people where you can look out for each other. It's definitely a local community. If especially if the proverbial stuff hits the fan, then definitely you would want to be in such a situation as that, where you're in a community of people who are looking out for each other, and who are prepared somewhat. But even if it doesn't hit the fan, even if there's just a slow collapse of the American empire, which seems kind of like the way we're heading, the dollar losing its status as the global reserve currency, for example. What's the best thing to do? I think it's just to rediscover what got people through tough times in the past, like the Great Depression, World War II, which is people living in communities where people knew each other and cared about each other, and cared about local institutions, probably more than national institutions. The local institutions were more meaningful to them than the national ones. I mean, one of the things back then is like every town had its own newspaper, and not just cities, but towns. Towns would have their own newspaper, their own media, their own entertainment. This was, I guess, during the Depression, you had radio was kind of the new thing, but with radio is limited. Whereas today it's like you just turn on a device on your phone or a computer and you access these, different forms of media created across the world and created, across all time almost, whereas back then it was like there was more, local entertainment even. I mean, vaudeville, maybe it was performers from out of town, but it would be you'd go to a theater and see performers live, for example, right, with people in your community. I don't know. There just seems to be something there. So anyway, I guess that's what is wrong with America. Well, one of the things is we've reached a point in our culture where, for some reason, and I'm guilty of this too, because it's a really swimming upstream to say, okay, instead of focusing on national and global institutions and news, you got to start with what's most immediately accessible, which is local stuff, local elections, local school boards, local, organizations, local entertainment, even local businesses. I mean, that's the answer to a lot of this ESG score garbage that's being peddled, or that they're trying to introduce, is just mom and pop type businesses, if you can find them, that's really the best thing. Now, one thing too, that this is something I have, you got to limit the amount of news you consume. And I've been guilty of this. It's like Bill Hicks, the comedian, he had this joke about and so this was in 1990 when he said this. So things were a little different back then. CNN wasn't as bad at that time as it is today. But he said, I don't know if you've ever watched CNN. I wouldn't recommend, watching more than 20 hours of it in a day. Well, anyway, he was talking about the whole, there's always some crisis. You no matter what time of day you tune in, there's always something going on, some breaking news. Oh my God, the world is going to end. There's this doom and gloom about it. And he's like, you step outside and it's like birds chirping, which he did the imitation of the bird sound, which I'm not talented enough with my mouth to make those animal noises. But, you get the idea. It's like, if if you watch too much of the news, it'll give you a distorted perspective about how bad things are. Things are bad though. I mean, it's a balancing act, because you want to know, for example, you want to know that there's real signs that there's food shortages coming, right? And even to the point now where President Biden goes off script and admits that, so you want to know, okay, I need to prepare, which you should probably do anyway, because you never know when some natural disaster might happen, in your area, whether it's earthquake, tornado, or whatnot. Well, obviously, if it's a tornado, your food supply is probably going to get scattered to the four winds. But you know what I mean, like where you never know, there could be a EMP or solar flare, or whatever. Basically, you want to have some extra food on hand, some extra supplies on hand, so that if for whatever reason you're not able to go grocery shopping, you're not just screwed on day two. You want to have a little bit of extra. But anyway, so I guess maybe the news isn't important for that. Yeah, it's still a good idea to know kind of generally what's coming. But there's something that Tim Ferriss refers to this in the 4-Hour Workweek as like the low information diet. But yeah, there's too much where you watch enough of the news and it's like the outrage machine can get you kind of hooked in, where it's like, oh my God, things are terrible. So anyway, it's good to watch things other than that. Stuff that's more geared towards, entertaining or edifying or instructing you or whatever, right? Stuff that's like got some value other than just what's the latest, crazy stuff that the people of this camp are doing or trying to pull. So anyway, for me, I've started watching the comedian Red Skelton on Amazon Prime, which it's a problematic thing having an Amazon Prime, because this is one of the big evil tech empires, but maybe I'll cancel it at some point. But for right now, I do have Amazon Prime anyway. The Red Skelton television show, at least the first 5 seasons is on. Red Skelton, he was a vaudevillian who had a radio show for a number of years and then had a television show up until like 1971, something like that. But anyway, he's one of those old timer where even though there were problems in the world at that time, certainly, you almost wouldn't know it from watching his show. It's very escapist in that sense, where it doesn't necessarily address current affairs or conflicts in the world or problems or things like that. And in fact, in his own personal life, he had some real tragedy where his son, I think, died of leukemia at 10 years old. Back at a time when that was like a brutal way to go. I mean, it still would be bad today, but it's like back then it was like things were even worse. The treatment had not progressed to where it is today. So anyway, his son kind of died a painful death at 10. Then his wife got, terminally ill years later, and the pain was too much. That at some point the pain medication wasn't working. She's terminally ill. She ended her own life, and she left a suicide note and said that she'd chosen the day, the 10-year anniversary of when their son had died of leukemia, so that he wouldn't have to grieve, a second anniversary or of during the year. I mean, it was a sad, he had some sad stuff going on in his life, and yet, you look at him and he comes across a very likable person. People back then, there was this kind of shtickiness about their act. And, so he was kind of in that camp. I mean, he came out of vaudeville and everything like that. But, there's also this genuineness and warmth as like a human being, that comes through with him, both in his performance and in interviews that I've seen of him that he did, particularly later in life. But anyway, watching that, right, where and this is one of the things that he said that kind of captures this, I think, where he was talking, this was when he was older, he said that, he believed that everybody's, born with a purpose, that is to, to create and not to destroy, and that if by chance someday you're feeling down or feeling bad, and you by chance remember some silly thing that I did or said, and it brings a smile to your face, or warmth to your heart, that he will have fulfilled his purpose as a clown. And I butchered that. I paraphrased it, and he said it much better than me. But then he said, thank you so much. May God bless. But there's something about Red Skelton. He's just one example. But I mean, watching his show is like, all right, this is a better use of my time than watching the news or listening to some outrage, or scrolling through social media or whatever. So I don't know. It's kind of escapist there. But, you can also do stuff like read books, work on learning a language, work on, a hobby, developing a skill, whatever. And that's one of the things I think is, if society does kind of tend to get worse over the next few years, it's probably a good idea to be versatile and have some skills that you've developed, that could be important, particularly repairing things, making things, So anyway, I think that's what I was wanting to talk about in this episode, and why I kind of haven't been. It's been a few weeks since I did the podcast, and that's part of the reason I was like, I got to get away from the doom and gloom, and get a more balanced perspective, but also, just focus on, like, it's very disempowering to just focus on all the crazy stuff going on in the world and think, man, the world is going to hell. It seems like, the craziest and most really terrible people are the ones at the top of these institutions, right? People that aren't looking out for the good of the people at large. They're not looking out for, like, how can I really make the world a better place for everybody? But it's more like, how can I impose by, my views on everybody else? How can I control? It's just power. It's just a will to power, and it's just, there's all the other stuff is a smoke screen. It's just a justification for it. These are people who don't give a rat's behind about you or me or whether we can feed our kids. If we're stepping out of line, if we're throwing a wrench in the machine, like the truckers were in Canada, they're all too happy to shut you out of your bank account, to just put you on the edge of starvation with your kids. They don't care. They're not good people. They're horrible human beings. I mean, now here's a distinction, and I'll talk about this more in a later time. There's definitely a distinction between the people who are running the propaganda machine and the millions of people who've been taken in by the propaganda. Right? Now, that's a very big difference. Now, some people, when they've been taken in by the propaganda, if they're given an opportunity to get red pilled or black pilled or whatever you call it, they see, oh, wait a minute, this is all like a concerted, campaign of disinformation to get me, to manipulate me into believing a certain thing and then voting a certain way or whatever, or being okay with them taking more and more freedom away from me. In that situation, there's the people can be good people still, even if they're confused. People can, but if they get to a point where they see the light, they have a choice. Then you can double down on the lies and disinformation and be like, I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to admit that I've been wrong. I don't want to admit that I was taken in by these people who are criminals and cheats and liars. Or you can say, man, I didn't know that. That's crazy. Like, what else do I not know? Personally, I had that kind of experience. Like, after 2016, I did have Trump derangement syndrome, because at that point I was still reading a lot of the mainstream legacy media, particularly the New York Times and the Washington Post, but other publications as well, the Atlantic, that I thought, it's like, yeah, maybe they have their bias, but they're not just going to make up stuff. They're not going to just, publish a story that patently false. Like, the facts are actually completely wrong and then cover it up. Well, it turns out that's basically what they do. So I learned, I was like, all right, there are things that I thought I knew about Trump or about, America or about the world that just ain't so. Who said it? There's somebody that has a saying. I'll think of this later and apologize to whoever it is. I think they're probably long gone. So maybe they're not alive anymore to take offense to this. But somebody that said, maybe it was Mark Twain, it's not the things that how did he say? He says, it's not the things that I know that, or it's not the things that I don't know that get me into trouble. It's the things that I know that just ain't so, or something like that. Anyway, that's basically true. But yeah, no, I said that this is just there's a difference between the people who run the propaganda machine and the people that have been taken in by it. The people that have believed the lies. I mean, kind of like there's a difference between the con artist. Say you're who's that guy? The Bernie Madoff, right? I say you have somebody like him, right? There's a difference between the people who maybe they didn't do their due diligence, or maybe they did, and I don't know, but people who were taken in by him, who thought, oh, this is a good thing, and they put their money in it, and so forth. And the person running the Ponzi scheme, who knows it's a Ponzi scheme, right? There's a difference there. And the people who are being taken in by it, you would hope that when they, and this is a problem with human nature, the sunk cost effect or whatever, people don't like to think, I just wasted my time, my money, whatever. Like they want to justify past decisions, right? So people, there's this possibility that people find out, oh, this is a Ponzi scheme, and then they realize that and say, oh, shoot, man, if this thing blows up, I'm going to lose everything. So I need to help keep it going as long as possible so that I can make some money out of it first before it blows up. And somebody that does that, they're just as bad as Bernie Madoff. But the people who just get taken in by it and they really believe that it's true, they're not. So that's one of the things I think that as time goes on, as more and more people realize, because the thing is the elites are getting less and less concerned with how believable their lies are. They will now just tell you lies and just openly screw up. You have this combination of incompetence and corruption that is just insane, and they don't care about making their lies believable, and so more and more people will come around and see like, oh, wow, this is really, I've been lied to. And when they do, those people should not be, they should be accepted, forgiven, whatever. If people are, repent, change your mind, change your orientation, change the way you believe about this, right? Like if somebody says, hey, I repent of my, support of these lockdowns and mandates and things like that. Now that I see what it's really about, there's no reason to hold on to like a grudge for people like that that were just legitimately taken in. Now, of course, and this is something that's very important when the time comes, if our elites, which they seem just determined to do, to crash and burn the economy. They're basically running the American economy and American government like a private hedge fund, where they're, instead of trying to build up value, instead of trying to invest in things that are going to, pay off years and decades in the future, they're just trying to extract as much value as they can from it today and sell off, mortgage, whatever remaining productive assets there are, so they can just keep the whole thing afloat and extract as much value for themselves as they can before the whole thing crashes. And then they're like, then we'll just move on to the next thing. They're basically vultures, parasites on society. Those people, the elites, absolutely no forgiveness. No, and it's not very Christian to say, but no, they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing, and they would, and like I said, with the Canadian truckers, people like Justin Trudeau, and we have them in America and all these other, first world countries, they would rather send, people with their families into homelessness, poverty, starvation, whatever. They would rather do that than give up 1 inch of power and control. They would rather sink the ship and yet remain in the captain's seat and go, than to keep the ship afloat and maybe have it be a little more democratic and less them in control of everything. Like, these are evil people. Anti-human, totally anti-human nature. For them, when I say no forgiveness, what I mean is, may God have mercy on their souls, but they need to face consequences. There should what I'm afraid of, and of course, is one of those things that seems to a lot of times happen. People will screw things up. Then when it becomes clear and nobody believes the lies anymore, they'll try to pivot and pretend that they were really on the right side all along. They were just taken in by it too. And it's like, no, you knew what you were doing, right? You know, I mean, imagine Bernie Madoff, right? Basically running the Securities Exchange Commission, SEC. And after his Ponzi scheme is exposed, you know, he manages to convince people that he's been a victim too, and blah, blah, blah. And that, you know, he's put me in charge of the SEC, and I will make sure that this all gets righted. And of course he just goes, they're basically sociopaths, you know, to where it's just, if you believe their lies, they'll just do it again. They're incapable of speaking truth. They're incapable of real empathy or real, you know, they're just horrible human beings. And I'm not talking about everybody that, you know, there's a few people who are really just have been shown to be so corrupt, so evil, that there's really, I don't think there's any redemption for them. Like, they're sociopaths. They've crossed so many lines. They've made so many deals with the devil. And I'm talking about Joe and Hunter Biden being examples of this. Just evil people. Just nothing, totally evil. You know, your Kamala Harris's, your Adam Schiff's, your Chuck Schumer's, Nancy Pelosi's, Gavin Newsom's, people like that. The people that you see, they obviously don't even believe their own lies, right? Like, all these people, how many of them will, you know, make a big deal about mandates and then turn around and violate the mandates privately with their very rich friends? And then when they're caught, rather than apologizing, rather than saying, you know, you're right, I should think about this differently, you know, it's more like, oh, well, I was just holding my breath in that picture I took with Magic Johnson, says Gavin Newsom, you know, requiring kindergartners to mask up in school while he goes to athletic events and mingles with people in close proximity, right? So anyway, back to what I was saying. I'm violating my own thing. I'm saying, what can one person do? Here I am talking about what the very elites are doing. What can we do as individuals, just normal people living in this world, trying to make the best of things? Number one, focus on what's next, what's around you, what you can, you know, the people in your life who you actually know, the people who you actually have real relationships with, which is, and particularly your own household, your children and so forth. But, you know, even more so, or not even more so, but also, you know, neighbors, real life people, family, friends, so forth around you, you know, because when stuff collapses, like, we can't trust or rely on big institutions. You know, that's been the solution. Instead of, you know, in historically, you know, when people have tough times, they get through with help from their neighbors and family and friends, right? Nowadays, it's like, well, you have insurance, or you have long-term care for your elderly, or you have daycare for your children, or you have, you know, there's all these institutions that provide the service if you can afford it, you know. Increasingly, as time goes on, less and less people are going to be able to afford it. And so more and more people are going to have to go back to the ways of, all right, I need to, you know, work out these things with people that I live with, you know, people that, you know, because we don't have these institutions, or we can't afford these services. So we got to do this for ourselves, you know, and you know, that's a huge thing. It's uphill battle, because it's really, if you grew up in the United States after World War II, which pretty much everybody alive today did, that's not really something that's in our nature. More and more, it's people are isolated. You know, there's more and more of people, you get roadside assistance, or you get an insurance company, or you get whatever, right? And the relationships themselves have eroded, to the point that most of the people live in neighborhoods today where you don't really know, maybe you know their names maybe, or you may wave and say hi, maybe even at Christmas, like people will, share, they'll take each other little baskets of, candies or whatever, maybe, or Christmas cards. But, for the most part, it's like people don't really know well their neighbors. But that's something that is the next project, I guess, for people who are, what can you do? Well, that's probably the best way to start, honestly. Focus on the small scale, and then of course your local community, your neighborhood and city and so forth. But anyway, all right, well, that's my 2 cents there on what can one person do given all that's wrong with America. But of course, and focusing on what's wrong is, don't just focus on what's wrong, focus on what's right, and how can we in our own individual personal lives, in cooperation with our friends and families and neighbors, do more of what's right, I guess. I don't know. So anyway, my name is Daniel T. This is the What's Wrong with America podcast. It is March 31st, 2022. Hope you guys have a great week. Thanks very much for listening, and God bless.